Opening Blender will show you this menu. This menu has New Files, Open Previous Files, the Manual, and the Release Notes and Development Funding. To start using Blender, you should click to the side of this menu. Clicking to the side will close the menu. When closing the menu, it will take you to the 3D viewport. This menu has a Y-axis, an X-axis, it has a camera module, a light source, and a cube. Inside of this cube, there are two components. There is a red and white circle, which is the world center, or the world cursor, and there is a dot in the middle of the cube, which is the object center, which is the center of the cube. Moving to the left side of the screen, you have a selection tool. You have a cursor tool, which moves the world cursor. You have a move tool. You have a rotation tool, a scale tool, and a transform tool. The transform tool is all three in one. Next, you have a annotation tool, and you have a measurement tool, and you have a shortcut to add a cube. Moving to the top part of the screen, you will see the Editor Type button, which shows all the types of editing tools that are in Blender. These can go from a 3D viewport, which is what we are in, to a timeline at the bottom of the screen. Now, the button to the right of that is the type of editing you are doing to the present object, the selected object. By default, you are on object mode, but if you switch to edit mode, it will give you options to edit the object, or sculpting, which will sculpt the object, or vertex painting, which will paint vertexes on the objects, weight painting, and texture painting. Now, going to the View button will show you a drop down of all the type of UI changes you can do to Blender, which means you can choose to remove or add the sidebar. You can choose to add or remove the toolbar, and you can also choose to remove tool settings. Pressing on the selection tool will show you all the ways to select objects or things in the viewport. You have a select all button, which will select all objects inside of the viewport. You have a none, which will deselect all objects. You have invert, which will invert said selected objects. Say as you have two objects that are selected and one not selected, they will be reversed. Only the light is now selected. You have a box selection tool, which will just drag and select all the objects you have in the box. You have a circle select, which is a drag selection tool that will allow you to drag and select all the objects that you drag. You have a lasso select, which lassos around all the objects you want to select. Next is the Add button. Now this is where you will add all the objects into the 3D viewport. Clicking Add shows a drop down of meshes, which can add planes, cubes, circles, and a lot more. You have Curve, which would give you types of curves that you can add that will not be rendered in Blender's final render. You have Surface, which you will not use. You have Metaballs, which you also will not use. You have Text in case you want to add 3D text to your model. You have Volume, which you will not use. Grease Pencil will allow you to 3D paint in your viewport. You have Armature, which is for animation. You have Lattice. You have Empty, which will show you plane axes or axes of objects that will also not appear in Blender's final render. You have Images, which will add images such as .jpegs or .pngs into your 3D viewport as a reference or a background. You have lights, point lights, sunlights, spotlights, and area lights. You have cameras, which will already be in the scene by default. You have speakers, which you will not use. You have force fields, which you will also not use. And collections, which are already by default in Blender. Next is object. This is object configuration or settings. In object configuration, you can move, rotate, scale, and transform, set origin, or configure lots of different ways about how objects or an object interacts with each other, or how you want to change an object in any way. Mirroring it, maybe, snapping it, joining it with another object, copying it, or any other way, even deleting it. Next, you can view the transform orientations of an object in the viewport. You can see by default it will be at global, which will follow the globally available Y, X, and Z axis, which would be left, right, forward, backwards, and up and down. Local, which will follow the object's orientation. So the object won't be moved in case it is rotated. Since the object is already completely straight and not rotated, changing it to local will make it also follow the normal global axes. But rotating the object and then changing it to the z-axis will allow it to go up and down the z-axis of the object. This is especially helpful when moving a camera forward or backwards, allowing it to go forward and backwards without moving it up and down. Skipping a few objects to the right, you will see this as in the material or object viewing. You can change it into X-ray mode, which will allow you to look through the object. You can turn it into wireframe, which turns the object into a wireframe or an outline of how the vertices and edges is shown. It will turn you into the default solid state that will show no texture. You can also change it into the material view, which will render the materials of your object in case you want to see them while you're configuring the object. This will not render the light of the object. Switching to the next one, you can see viewport shading, which will shade the object and do all the lighting and rendering inside the viewport. Now let's go back to the default shading. The X, Z, and Y little axis thing right here, this will show you the axes that you are currently on in your point of view. If you click it and move the mouse, it will move your camera around the screen. Now going down 2 steps will also move your mouse left, right, up, and down when you click the little grab hand. Clicking the camera button will snap you to the camera that is in your scene. It will show you how the object will seem when it is fully rendered. Now, after showing the viewport section, you can move to the right side where you will see the Properties tab. This tab has lots of information about selected objects. As you can see, clicking this button will show you that this block in the Blender grid is actually any block you want it to be. If you wanted to, you could change it to the viewport, but we're going to just leave it as properties. Now, going down the list, you will see at the top world settings or world properties. In the scene settings, you will see the render engine, which by default is Eevee and should be used for lower power devices. On the next tab, you will see the output information or how you want your final render to be. This is mostly for animation. You can change the frame rate. You can change how long you want it to end. You can also change it in the timeline down there. You can also go down, you'll see the output. Whenever you want to output your render animation as a video file, you want to change the /temp right there. You want to click the button to the right. When you're going to the output, you want to click the location you want to save to and hit accept. Now I must emphasize, this is not you saving your video. You still have to render it. This is just where it's going to render. Now this file format button, which has defaulted to PNG, and if you're only rendering an image, do not change it from PNG. If you're rendering a video, change it to FFmpeg or one of the AVI options. Going to the red globe tab will show you configurations for the world. And this is quite similar to texturing an object where it says the surface is a background. It's quite similar. Now the default color is gray. You can just click it and it'll open up a color wheel. Then you can change it to whatever color you want. And as you can see, it's not changing the background. So we're going to render it instead of just having it on solid view. And the cube is also blue due to the reflections or rendering. Going to the normal material viewport will only render textures on objects, not the world. Now the strength is of course the strength of the color. Now going to the wrench tab, the modifier tab, will show you all the modifiers that are available to Blender. Now these modifiers are very, very key in your Blender workflow. I would recommend going through, clicking on your cube and going through and adding each individual one to your Blender model just to see what they do and how settings configuring them can change the object. Make sure not to change any setting too high or it may crash your computer. This is the physics tab. Now this is also the same as the modifier tab, but it shows settings for the physics. If we click on fluid, it shows fluid settings. The next one is the constraints. If you want to have an object interact with another object during an animation or in general, you can use these to have that happen. Now, if we look into the material section of object properties, you can see there are lots and lots of settings that you can configure for a material. The top one is the material that is actually on the object at this moment. Every object comes with the default material as a material. You can remove or add a material. You can click the drop down menu here to see all the materials that you have in your Blender save right now. As you can see, even deleting the material does not remove it from the Blender save, so we can just add it back. Now, removing it, and you can also add a new material, which creates another separate material. Now let's use this default material. There are also options next to it to remove the material. Now let's add it back. There are also new material, which you can make a new material again. There's also a preview tab right below. Now this previews the material that you have on your object in any object that you want to see, just to determine UV mapping or any other thing you want to see. Now going down to the surface section, this is the configuration for the actual material. Now the surface option right there, this is the actual lighting shader that will be on your object. Now there are lots and lots of different material shaders. The default one, Principled BSDF, can do 99% of the things that other shaders can do. So by default, we're just going to use Principled BSDF. Now going down to where it says base color, this is the base color of your object. As you can see, it changes the color in the preview and not in the viewport. That is because we need to change it to texture viewport, which shows the texture in the viewport. Now subsurface is how much light of the subsurface color bleeds through the base color. Changing the subsurface color to another color such as green will also make the subsurface bleed through. If we turn it to 1, it'll bleed through completely. Changing it to a half gives us a nice color. Now there are also many settings that Principled BSDF has, such as metallic, specular, roughness, and a lot more. Now, a useful material setting of Principled BSDF would be emission. Emission is how much light an object gives off. This is not light as the same way as a sunlight or a spotlight. This is just the material light. Changing it to blue will look like we're changing the base color to blue, but this is the emission of the object, the color, for to say. If you change the strength, it's going to get whiter and whiter as to show how much strength of light is coming off of it. If we open a new default Blender instance, you can see it's back to default. Now, looking around, you may notice that these cubes or sectioned off areas of Blender sort of can be configured. Now, if you see my mouse change and you drag, you can now move out or down the actual windows. So moving it and configuring it to your heart's content. Anyone, it does not matter. There's a lot of freedom within Blender. Now, if you want to remove a section, you can right click and hit join areas. Now, if I hit the top one, it will remove the 3D viewport. If I remove the bottom one, it'll remove the timeline. Let's remove the viewport. Clicking removes the viewport and makes the timeline take up the whole screen. Going to the left top and clicking the change style, we can click it and go 3D viewport. Now we're back on the 3D viewport. Now if we want to add the timeline back, you will click on any of the corners of said window that you want to extend to. Be careful not to accidentally do this, because this will remove one of your windows. Get used to practicing that. Now if you slowly drag up from one of the corners, it'll extend another window. Then we can just change it to a timeline. Now we have our timeline back. You can do this with any window. You can join them. You can also change any window to any other type of window. So let's fill our page with a bunch of viewports. Now we have a bunch of viewports. This may not be practical, but the freedom allows you to do whatever you want. Now, if we look at the right top of the Blender screen, you'll see this little page. This is the Explorer tab. Now, the Explorer tab shows all the available components in your Blender scene or in your Blender file right now. As you can see, we only have a camera, cube, and light, and you're able to select them in this Explorer to easily access them without having to move around in your 3D view. This is helpful, for instance, when you add an object and it goes inside of another object. Now, let's say you want to select it, you can just click it in the Explorer, and then you have easy access. Other things that you can do are double-clicking to rename it, or you can hide an object in the preview viewport, which is what you're viewing, and you can also hide it from the camera by clicking the camera button. Now, clicking the camera button will hide it from your final render, so when you render the object, it will not appear there. This is good for guidelines or anything that you just don't want to appear. Take note that you do not need to hide any curves in your render, because the curves already do not render by default. Right-clicking an object in the Explorer tab shows you all the simple configuration you can do. You can copy, paste, delete, you can select, you can do lots of things that you want to your objects. If you go to the very, very left top of Blender, you'll be able to see the small button, the splash screen. This will just take you back to the splash screen. There are also a few other buttons. These aren't very useful, but if you go to File, you'll see lots and lots of settings about the file of how Blender. You can import things, you can export things, you can open recent Blender files, open files from a directory, make new Blender files. You would usually use General to make new files, as General can do everything. Save Blender files, save copies, and you can just save it in general. Edit will show you undoing. You can undo your Blender instance. You can do preferences, which is settings, and you can do a lot in Edit tab too. Now the Render tab is where you render your image or animation. Render image, of course, renders a single frame of your entire render. Rendering the animation will render your animation from frame 0 to all the way how many frames you already had, or how many frames you have it ended. By default, it's 250. You can also render audio. You won't use that. You can view the render, which will display the .png file that you saved. And you can also view the animation, which will play the video file. Now, if you go to layout, now by default, Blender puts you in layout. You can change to any one of these tabs. Now, a lot of people think that these tabs are set in stone. You cannot model in layout, but that is untrue. You can do anything in any one section. It's just organized defaults that Blender adds to Blender by default. So you can go to animation to animate if you want. You can also animate in layout, but you can also animate in modeling. You can animate in texture paint, as long as you know how to change the windows, as I showed before. But the thing about these is it shows good defaults. You see texture paint shows a UV map on the left and the texture size and information on the right with a big fat viewport in the middle. If we go to something like UV editing, then it'll show a UV map on the left and the viewport on the right, which is all you need. Sculpting, of course, has the big viewport and the brush size on the right. Now, modeling will just show you the vertices or whatever edge or face you want to select, and will help you move. Now, something to know is when opening a new Blender session and moving around, you can see how clicking on the cube, clicking on object, there are lots of different things. If we delete the object right there by going to object and delete, you can add a new object by adding let's add this cube back. And now the cube spawns at the very center of that red and white circle. The world cursor is where every new object that you add spawns, no matter what. So let's click on cursor and click anywhere on the screen to move it. And we go back to selection, hit add, and we can hit cube. Now the cube spawns over there. This is no exemption. Absolutely every object will spawn at the center of there unless you change the world cursor. Move it there. Now the cube's over there. Now, this is very, very helpful and important. And there are many ways that you can configure the cursor. There's one that's snap. Snap will change how your object interacts, or the center of your object interacts with the world cursor. Let's say we go back to that cube. Oh, I moved it. Let's move it back to a random position. Now if we go back to cursor, you can click on the cube, hit add or object, go snap, and then you can do cursor to selected. Now cursor to selected will move the world cursor to the center of the object. Now this is very helpful if you have a centerpiece in your scene, and when you spawn in new objects, or when you add in new objects, they'll be at the center of that object instead of the center of the world. Now add circle. Now this cube has a ring if we want it to have it a ring. It's very, very helpful for centering objects, having evenness. And if you want to move it back to the very, very center of the world, then you're going to want to know how to open up the tool options or the side menu. Now, when you double click that little arrow, it's very, very small. You'll get a box right here with a few options, and you'll have the first thing will be item. Now, item is what you have selected. We have the location. We have rotation. We have scaling. And we also have dimension. Now, if we go to the next slide, you have tool. Now, tool isn't very useful. You won't be using that, but what you can do is you can change the orientation to global, or if you change the orientation to global on the active tool, it will not listen to the local that you set at the top. So it's still going global, but if you set the orientation in the active tool to default, it will now do local movement. Now going to view. this has a few options. Now, focal length right there at the very, very top, 50 millimeters is the very default. If you ever see yourself being zoomed in too much or zoomed out, you may want to set it to 50. Now, this is not changing the camera. This is changing your view. Now, clip start and end is how much you can see. As you can see, when I zoom out far, I lose the objects in grid in the very distance with that sort of gray fog. You can extend that by raising it to like a value of 20,000, for example. Now, if you go down a little bit, or if you zoom in and get really close to an object, you can change the clip start. That will make it zoom in really, really close, and you'll be able to see it still. Now, if we want to change the world cursor back to the center of the world, we can move it anywhere. And as you can see in the 3D cursor section, you have the location of the 3D cursor. We can just set all three of these to 0. Now it's at the very, very center of the 3D cursor, or of the world, excuse me. We can also rotate it if necessary, but when we spawn in a new object, then you get the cursor or the cylinder is now in the center of the world. Now I have an empty scene right here, and I can show you how to add another object. Once I add a new object, when you add a new object, it'll have a little menu in the left bottom. Now I already have this menu open, but when you originally open an object, it'll be small like this. Now clicking away will make it, doing any action at all, clicking away, clicking off of it, will remove that menu. If you want to configure the object that you just added, you might want to not click it and then open that menu. Click the menu to open it, and it shows you a few settings, or it depends on what your object is, but it'll show you settings depending on that object. You can change the radius, the depth, you can move it around the world, and you can rotate it. Now, if you click off of the object, it'll make the menu disappear. You can still rotate it, scale it, and move it afterwards. So it's not that helpful of a feature. But now I'm in local. Let me change it to global so it moves and rotates and scales and globally. Now, if I move it up and make it thick with a scale and I change it to local, I can also add it like this instead of global. Now I extended it without having to stretch it out anymore.